Hello everyone, my name is Scott Gross and I am honored to have Congresswoman Tulsi Gabbard, a presidential candidate, here in Goffstown to discuss, a whole lot of issues and just really get to know you a little bit better.
Yeah.
So I just want to start off New Hampshire's a wonderful place, the hotbed of politics. I was having lunch with your sister. I saw the shirt. I tend to engage in conversation with strangers, and we were chatting for about 5 or 10 minutes, and she says, well, I am Tulsi's sister, and lo and behold, you're here today.
Here we are.
Yeah, you're here. So I always like to, when I have these conversations, I always try to start it off with just a quick question.
Yes.
Help me understand the fascination of Spam in Hawaii. Because I can never understand. I've seen it. My dad used to eat it, and
it's really become a culture thing where Hawaii's history is in agriculture. And back in the day, there were 4 big corporations or businesses that owned the land, and they grew sugarcane, pineapple, and so on. And they brought in immigrants from all over the world to come in and work work the land. Portuguese, Filipino, Japanese, Chinese, Vietnamese, people from all over the world coming together. And somehow through all of that, way back when, there was a melting pot of cultures that Spam crossed all ethnic lines. And so you see it.
So it's the proverbial glue of Hawaii in a way.
I wouldn't go that far,
okay.
but it's become a bit of a universal thing. I actually grew up vegetarian, so I was never a part of the Spam partaking part of the community. But there's like a Spam festival every year. The big controversy recently was when Spam announced pumpkin spice Spam. That was a huge topic of conversation at home.
So you decided to run for president. Can you help me understand? I mean, this is a huge undertaking. What prompted you to say, you know what, I need to do this?
Yeah. Well, in order to understand that, I want to tell you a little bit about my background because that's really what motivated my decision. I serve in the Army National Guard. I'm a soldier, enlisted after 9/11, and have been serving now for over 16 years. Currently serving as a major. And I've deployed twice to the Middle East. The first deployment was to Iraq in 2005, where I served in a field medical unit where every single day I saw the terribly high human cost of war. There was a time in the war, if you remember, there was very high casualties. It was early on, and the very first thing that I did every single day while I was there for just about a year was go through a name-by-name list. Go look at every single name of every American casualty and injury that had occurred the day before. And so my job was to go, we had about 3,000 soldiers there with our brigade combat team. I had to look to see if there were any of our soldiers who were on that list, if they had been hurt. Were they getting the care they needed? Did they need to be evacuated out to another country or back home as quickly as possible? And it was just a heart-wrenching thing every day to know that every one of these service members had loved ones, family, friends at home, was really worried sick for them, and that these were the people who were paying the price for war. This experience through both of my deployments is really what motivated me to run for Congress back in 2012, so that I could be in a position to make the decisions that would impact where and when our men and women in uniform are sent into harm's way. We're at a place now where we know a couple of things. The most important responsibility that the president has is to serve as commander-in-chief. Our country has been waging these wasteful, counterproductive wars, like the war in Iraq, a regime change war in Libya, Syria, ongoing troop presence in Afghanistan now. All of these wars and conflicts not helping make our country more safe, and instead creating a situation where terrorist groups like Al-Qaeda and ISIS have grown stronger. So we have seen the cost of war and the toll it's taken on our troops. And our country, we as taxpayers have spent trillions of dollars.
It's been a long time. It's been like 20,
since
right?
9/11, almost 20
years where
almost
we've
20
been
years.
Waging war.
Exactly. Yeah. And so you work in education, and the reality is over $6 trillion spent since 9/11 alone, $6 trillion. And yet we lack the resources we need to pay for the quality education that our kids need. I was talking with special ed teacher outside a little bit earlier, and she was talking about how difficult it is to get the kind of funding necessary for special education here in New Hampshire. These are the kinds of things that require our attention, require the dedication of our resources, rather than continuing to spend our money on these wasteful wars. So I made the decision to run for president at this point in time to bring about this major change in our foreign policy, recognizing it's connected, the money we're spending is connected to all the domestic challenges we need to face, end these wasteful wars, work to end this new Cold War we're in with escalating tensions between the US and nuclear-armed countries like Russia and China, the arms race that's escalating, and instead redirect those resources that would have continued to be spent on these wars and weapons and dedicate them to serving the needs of the people we have in our communities all across this country, because those needs are great.
So you talked a little bit about like a priority,
Yes.
and a lot of times presidents are judged by their first 100 days in office. If you were elected president, what do you think would be your first 2 or 3 priorities in that first 100? What are the things that you're going to work on most quickly, I should say?
Well, it's exactly what I'm talking about, getting to the heart of where our money is going and getting it back to where it needs to be to serve our people. So if it doesn't happen already, and I think it needs to happen right now, but if this president doesn't do it, then as president, the very first thing I would do is to bring our troops home from Afghanistan. This is something that should have happened long ago, and in doing so, then we take $4 billion every month that we're spending in Afghanistan. $4 billion a month.
I don't think a lot of people understand
No.
the cost
Exactly.
of things,
because it's not really talked about
right.
that much. We're very concerned about the troops that we still have deployed there who are still being killed in combat. We need to bring them home, but there's also a cost and a toll that's being taken on every one of us as taxpayers. So Afghanistan is one example, but looking at the other places where we have our troops deployed, and really looking at is their presence in this country making the American people more safe? Is it serving our national security interests or not? And if it's not, then we need to bring them home and bring home the resources that we've been spending on those wars as well, and use it. Healthcare is a huge issue that's top of mind for so many people. Use it to provide the resources necessary to make sure that we have healthcare for all. The opioid epidemic is something that
big problem
is
here
a
in New Hampshire.
huge issue.
Yeah.
And I think one of the main there's a few elements to that. One is the issue of accountability and the lack of prosecution for big pharmaceutical companies like Purdue Pharma, for example, and others who are just now starting to be challenged in the courts, but they have cheated and lied their way through making more money off of proliferating these drugs in our streets without accountability. So that is incredibly important. We can take some of the resources that'll come from the fines that should be levied to them and dedicate that towards treatment facilities, making sure that people have those beds in those treatment facilities and the resources necessary to walk down that long path towards recovery.
Congresswoman, I know that you've heard this story probably 100 times, but folks in New Hampshire are really frustrated with, I guess, the lack of progress they're seeing in Congress in Washington, D.C. in particular with our elected officials. There is almost gridlock with the partisanship.
Yeah.
And you've served 2 or 3 terms. I'm just curious, is there a light at the end of the tunnel, or what can happen here? Because it just seems it's not only is it polarized in Congress, but we're seeing communities, friends who maybe aren't friends now, or family members who aren't talking, and it is sad. And what do you think you can bring to maybe help bring us all together as
Heal
one big
those
family
divides.
again? Yeah,
I know, and it really is a travesty to see how divided our country has become and continues to become with the hyper-partisanship in our politics and people in positions of power and influence further tearing us apart, trying to divide us based on our political affiliation or the color of our skin or our religion or orientation or all these other things that are really what makes up our diversity as a country. And this is something I talk about a lot as we're visiting different towns and communities, because this unity that we find in the foundational principles of our country, our freedoms, and who we are as Americans is really the bedrock for our country, and it's what provides us with that path forward of how we come together, how we heal those divides.
You know, I was telling your sister when we were at the sandwich shop in town that locally in New Hampshire and a lot of other parts of the country, they're nonpartisan elections, and having served on a select board and a school board, they don't have an R or a D after your name or an I or an L. You just serve, and even though you have different beliefs, at the end of the day, you talk in the parking lot. You might grab something to eat or have a drink afterwards, and you might get a little angry, but you get over it quickly because you have to solve the problems of the town. And you just wonder, how did we get so far away from that, and how do we get back?
Yeah, you know, I point to the inordinate amount of power that the two political parties have, and how unfortunately they're more focused on how they can beat each other in the next election.
Can almost contain power.
Exactly, and making all their decisions based on that, purely politically driven, rather than doing what you're talking about, saying, hey, look, we may have different ideas on how to solve these problems that we're facing, but our responsibility is to the voters who entrusted us with the jobs that we have. And therefore, we have to be able to come together, debate fiercely sometimes, be able to disagree without being disagreeable, but ultimately be able to come together and say, hey, even if it's getting a few more yards down the field, that's progress. Let's start there. Then we can build on that and build on that and build on that. This is something that I've done throughout my time in Congress. I've been serving there now for almost 7 years. And the first 6 years were as a Democrat in the minority. Republicans were in the majority in Congress. And one of the first things that I was told when I got elected and went to DC by a long time, DC politico, was, well, gosh, Tulsi, you're in the minority. Don't even try to get a bill passed, because you're not going to be able to, because Republicans in charge and they'll block you no matter what. So don't waste your time. I was unwilling to accept that recommendation. And so I immediately got to work and just started reaching out to folks, introducing myself to them, not coming in, casting kind of prejudgments saying, well, you're a Republican, you're this, you're that, therefore fill in the blank, but instead saying, hey, I'm a veteran, I'm a soldier, here are the things that my constituents are concerned about. Tell me about you. Tell me about your constituents. And really building a relationship based on respect, and doing so from the get-go has enabled me to be very effective in serving my constituents in Hawaii, passing legislation, passing amendments, even though Republicans were in charge. And so it's that experience and that kind of inclusive leadership that is based on respect for each other as fellow Americans that I would bring to serving the country and all Americans as president.
I want to pivot a little bit over to the economy. And on one hand, we have good indicators when you see a relatively low unemployment. We also have some bad indicators where you have a rising debt level, which is getting to be, some would argue, unsustainable. How do we kind of balance those things out? What are your ideas to make sure that we're not spending money that we don't have, but by the same token, making sure that whatever money that we do have is invested in programs and policies that are serving America's
real needs.
Right.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, to your first point, the economy and the numbers that we see when the jobs report comes out, or we look at what our GDP is. You look at these very, very high level numbers that right now are painting a relatively positive picture, which for the things that are working good for our economy, we should sustain those things. But I think it's important to point out that that doesn't paint the full picture. That I can speak for my home state of Hawaii. We've got a high cost of living.
Right.
And while our unemployment numbers are very low, I can tell you for friends of mine, people are working 2 and 3 jobs. So looking at quality of life, we've got a lot of work to do to make it so that people aren't spending their entire lives just trying to survive, just trying to keep.
And we were talking about housing before.
Exactly.
And you look at a lot of folks all across the country are struggling to, afford to buy a home and or pay rent on an apartment because the costs are astronomical. So I think
and the wages are not rising commensurately with the rising cost of living. I think that's one of the big challenges as we speak about our economy and the quality of people's lives and the struggles that they have is a living wage is not the norm for a lot of folks, which leads to having to work 2 or 3 jobs in the process. You bring up the national debt and the deficit. Again, this goes back to kind of the premise of what I talked about getting our priorities straight as a country, to stop wasting an inordinate amount of our limited resources on these counterproductive wars, so that we can make sure we're bringing down the debt and deficit, being responsible with what we are spending our money on, meeting the needs and priorities of our people, while also cutting out and closing these tax loopholes that have been built in really to benefit not the average working American, but the very few and the rich and powerful who really are buying their influence in Washington.
How do you do this, by the way? I'm curious. Your message is one of, I would say, fiscal restraint for the U.S. military.
Yes.
But yet you serve actively in the U.S. military.
That's right.
Help me understand how that impacts you in terms of...
There's no contradiction. And somebody asked me this earlier. We had a town hall earlier today, and somebody asked me that same question, a former Marine who came, and he was wondering the same thing. There is no contradiction. When we're talking about ensuring our national security, making sure that our military, my brothers and sisters in uniform, are taken care of, that they and their families are being served, that they are trained, they have the equipment that they need, and they are prepared to fulfill that mission of keeping the American people safe. This is a priority. It's something that I've been working through and doing throughout my time in Congress, serving on the Armed Services Committee. We do a disservice to our troops when we continue to wage these wasteful wars in a few ways. Obviously, continuing to put their lives on the line unnecessarily in fighting battles that have nothing to do with keeping our country and our people safe.
It seems like, I'm sorry to interrupt. It seems like our foreign policy for the last few decades is to, I guess, align ourselves with the enemy of our enemy. I mean, it seems like it's always shifting where we're friendly with one group, and then when they turn on us, then we go to the next one, and it's an ever-evolving...
It just doesn't make sense. Like, it doesn't make sense. The essential questions are not being asked and answered by our leaders, which is, how does this mission, this war, this conflict, this action best serve the interests of the American people, best serve the interests of our national security, and what are the costs and consequences of our getting involved? And so many of these wars have been waged because the United States is trying to be the world's police, or they're wars waged in the guise of humanitarianism when really there's other motives at play, whether they are corporate motives, saying, hey, well, we want to control the oil in this country, so we need to control the country, and so on and so forth. There's a lot of different examples there, but...
So interestingly, that position is not that far off from President Trump, in the sense that he has made statements to that effect, and some of his decisions have certainly led. What is the difference between your position and the president's position?
Trump's rhetoric in his campaign in 2016 sounded a lot like me.
That's why I'm asking the question.
And that was one positive thing that I had hoped would come about. I obviously did not support him and was disappointed when he got elected. But I thought, gosh, if he carries through on the things he said he would do in our foreign policy and ending these stupid wars, bringing our troops home, our country benefits as a result. The problem is that as president, he has not carried through on those promises. He has surrounded himself with people like John Bolton, who was an architect and champion of the Iraq War, and someone who for a very long time has been pushing our country to go to war with Iran, has been pushing our country to overthrow the government in Venezuela, and this is what he's doing now as President Trump's national security advisor, which is dangerous in my view and very, very costly. And Trump has not brought our troops home from Afghanistan. I think they're working on that now, which I think is a good thing, but we've seen more troops deploying to Afghanistan, to Syria, more troops deploying to Saudi Arabia, setting up for what could be an eventual war in Iran that the Trump administration's policies have pushed us towards. So, Trump's policies have unfortunately undermined the promises that he made on his campaign. And I'll tell you what, when we have our campaign gatherings, our town hall meetings, we get folks at every single one of them who are coming and either saying, I'm a Republican or I'm an independent. I voted for Trump in 2016, and I feel betrayed because he let us down. And coming and supporting my candidacy, not only because of my commitment to bringing about this change in our foreign policy, but really the experience that I bring to the table. And I think that's a big distinction point, not only between me and Donald Trump, but really between me and every other Democrat who's running for president.
Because I think, if I'm not mistaken, there's only a couple that have any type of military service out of a field that was formerly almost 20 folks.
Yeah.
I want to, if I could, I want to talk to you a little bit about education. Working, in a school district.
Yes.
We're just seeing intense pressure in terms of coping with costs, special education costs, et cetera. And I know that you had a conversation earlier with one of my colleagues. What's your position on how perhaps the federal government can assist local school districts or the states in delivering, quality public education to students?
Yeah. We as a country, as we say, we need to invest in our children. We need to invest in our future. Unfortunately, are not seeing that carried through actions and the amount of funding that's actually being provided to our kids, to our educators, and to our schools. I think we have to put our money where our mouth is. If we're serious about setting ourselves and our country up for success, we have to make that investment now, as our kids are young, as they're growing up and going through our education system, and making sure our teachers have the resources that they need to be able to do so. My parents both studied, they're teachers by trade and by training. My mom was a speech therapist who first started working in special education. Dad was an administrator who's working as a dean in a community college. And so that's the background that we grew up with, really emphasizing the importance of education, but also seeing on the flip side, when it comes right down to it, those resources, you hear a lot of lip service, but those resources are not getting to where they need to be the most. So for me as president, education has to be a priority because it has such a huge implication on every single aspect of our lives. We see communities that may not emphasize education, or kids who don't have access to resources end up making other choices in their lives that lead them astray, that don't set them best up for success. So it's something that not only helps these kids, it's something that's important for all of us as a country.
All right. Well, we have to kind of wind down now.
All right.
I just want to thank you so much for visiting Goffstown and New Hampshire. I want to wish you the best of luck.
I appreciate it.
And if you're ever in Goffstown again, let us know. We'll have you in. Thank you so much.
I just want to share my gratitude with you for stopping and saying hi to my sister.
Yeah.
That's how this all came about today. And for anybody who's watching at home who would like more information, they can visit my website at tulsi2020.com.
All right. Thank you so much.
Thank you.